The premiers of Gauteng and the Western Cape both delivered their State of the Province addresses in their respective provinces yesterday. Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi outlined that Gauteng is winning the war against crime. He says they are dealing decisively with notorious crime syndicates, especially those involving bank robberies, illegal mining, drug and child trafficking, and cash-in-transit heists. However, the event got off to a shaky start after chaos erupted in the Legislature that was sitting at the Nasrec Expo Centre south of Johannesburg. Meanwhile, in the Western Cape, Premier Alan Winde outlined his plans for the Western Cape province to combat crime, deliver quality education and create jobs during his State of the Province address. Winde said the Western Cape is on its way to becoming the first load-shedding-free province in the country. All right, to pack both State of the Province addresses, we are joined by independent political and economic analyst, Dr. Dale McKinley, and national coordinator of the South African Democracy Election Network, Reverend Derek Marco. Gentlemen, great to have you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Leanne. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Dale, let me begin with you. All right, so as I mentioned, the Gauteng Premier, having a bit of a tough start with bottles being thrown across Nasrec while he was trying to deliver the State of the Nation addresses. There was a point of order, and this is all around those, the protection, the crime wardens that were at this. Meantime, this is the one thing he was saying, we've got crime under control, but then, of course, things got out of control at the start. How was that for the opening? I mean, what did you make as the beginning of the State of the Province address?
Yeah, I think it reminded us very much of the scenes in the National Parliament a few years ago with the EFF being thrown out. But I think the larger point here is that it's problematic that that all of these, I think hundreds of so-called law enforcement or extra law enforcement agents, untrained largely, and job creation program were allowed to come into in large numbers and essentially mess the situation up in the context of this is supposed to be a very serious public address, not a political situation where people are basically making and scoring political points. So in that context, I think it was unnecessary for the Premier to allow them to come in. I think it just took away from the occasion. But irrespective of that, I think the claims that the Premier made around crime were typical of a state, in this case, State of the Province address or State of the Nation address, which is to exaggerate a range of numbers, but not to pay particular attention to the implementation, the reality on the ground. I was particularly I think sort of a wry chuckle when he talked about, for example, the e-panic button and these kinds of initiatives that were going to save people and the responses. And in my community of Brixton in Johannesburg, the average response time is 4 hours if you're wanting the police to come to assist you. So there's a long way to go in that context.
There certainly is, and I know he spoke a lot of these officers, and I mean, there have been a lot of reports doing the rounds as to the bad training that's gone into these Panyazas, as they are known, these crime wardens. But he's saying that, they're getting the best training at the moment. He claims, I mean, he was speaking about it yesterday, these wardens are being trained on many things, from firearm competence, drone pilots, training in crowd control, advanced driving, anti-land invasion. He said, in fact, the number has gone from 7,000. They're going to increase this to 12,000, and they'll be also trained under the SANDF. I mean, so there's a lot of promises, and he is saying that these are going to be the key to combating crime in the province. Can we believe this? I mean, besides the e-panic button, as you mentioned.
No, I don't think so. I think it's, first of all, if we really want to tackle the issue of crime, and let's deal with the police. The police are our front line against crime. They're the ones that should be properly trained, properly resourced, and the only thing he had to say, for example, on the police was that they had delivered many new vehicles in that regard. So to try to basically say that we're going to take a bunch of youth who are going to be trained by the army, which is not trained to do policing work, but is trained to do army work, to defend our borders, to shoot and kill people. It's a very, very troubling situation. Who are they under? What control? What happens when they break the law themselves? Who are they responsible to? So I think in some ways this is typical of Premier Lesufi's sort of approach, which is to do things really big and loud and say this is going to deal with the problem and not deal with the basics. The basics are fundamental to the police, and we have a crisis within the police themselves. Let's deal with that before seeking solutions, supposedly solutions to the crime problem, by creating more agencies, more budgets being taken, and not enough, as the Premier said, less talk and more action.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that point, because he did talk a lot, and he did tell us a lot about what's going on. I mean, even the promise of CCTV cameras and helicopters and all of these kind of things. This talk less and do more and get Gauteng back to work. May I ask you, Dale, what has changed since last year?
Well, unfortunately, if one looks at the reality of the situation in our province, things have not really gotten much better. I mean, let's take, for example, the jobs claims. The Premier was claiming that the province had created 90,000 jobs in 1 year. What he, of course, didn't say was how many jobs had been lost in the economy during that year, which is quite a bit more. So there was a net loss of jobs, not a net gain of jobs in Gauteng. He talked about the state of our cities, the key cities in the province, and how service delivery is basically on its knees. But he didn't have a great deal to say about what the province was going to do other than possibly step in if municipalities were declared dysfunctional. We have the largest and richest city in the country, Johannesburg, which is effectively bankrupt. This is an indication of where things are at the moment. And that is a result of political infighting and political factionalism and musical chairs being played across the board. And so I think what the Premier, understandably, in an election year, he's going to want to pump up the numbers and say we've done 1, 2, 3, and 4. But if you look, we could talk about the healthcare situation. He made it sound as though all of our public hospitals are functioning incredibly well, and people have gotten a lot of service, when we know that the primary healthcare clinics hardly have any equipment, for example, or hardly have any medicines. So these kinds of basics, I think, are the things that are being missed within the Premier's perspective. And he's concentrating on sort of the big ticket items and not really concentrating on the fact that for most people in Gauteng, life is tough and life has not gotten a great deal better for them. And they're wondering what the province is going to do as a result of that in putting bread and butter onto the table.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Gauteng is living testimony that we need a lot of work to bring this province back to where it was. Reverend, thank you for your patience. Reverend Derek Marco also joining us here today. We're discussing two SOPAs, of course, Gauteng, which we've been talking to. We haven't spoken about the Western Cape as yet. And Reverend, this is where I want to bring you in, because the Western Cape Premier Alan Winde also starting off, I mean, earlier on in the afternoon, we did see some protesters gathering before the state of the province, all complaining about service delivery and saying that, again, promises are being made in that province as well that are just not being delivered. Housing, electricity, all of these kind of things. There were protests ahead of the SOPA. So let's talk about the mood within the Western Cape as well.
Cape is twofold, I think. The Premier tried to present one particular side to the mood itself. I think there's a general sense of loss and neglect on the one hand, but I think there's also a level of optimism which he presented in his address last night. I think what he did last night was so you have both these dimensions playing itself out, but what he did was to try and strike a balance. But if you measure it on the grid of equality, I think there is a lot still to be considered with regard to the province itself. I'm not doing a political analysis. I'm doing an assessment. But I think it is critically important that we recognize two things. One, it is an election year, and two, besides the election year, we are also in a very serious contestation of democracy with over 70 plus countries across the world involved in these elections. So or involved in elections. So within that context, I think we need to locate this discussion for the Western Cape itself.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, it's unbelievable. An unprecedented amount of people are going out to vote this year around the world in elections. So it is going to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest year where people go out and vote new leadership. But that's what we're seeing here in South Africa. And I mean, electioneering is at its peak because as much as it's a State of the Province address, we also saw, and Reverend, let me speak to you about this, we saw Winde touching on the unfolding crisis in the Middle East. He was saying that many Western Cape residents are rightly affected and deeply concerned about this, but the province has its own serious crisis and violence in the country. So let's perhaps look at the Premier moving in that direction and devoting quite a bit of time to talking about what's happening in Palestine, well, Gaza and Israel.
Well, I mean, I was extremely fascinated and also appreciated the point that the Premier took a very clear position on Palestine, although he placed it within the context of the broader Middle East. He clearly spoke about children and women and the suffering out there, which gave us an indication of where this province potentially locates itself in the bigger conversation of the oppression and the suffering and the destruction of Palestine at this time. So that was a very, very significant statement on his part, and one needs to acknowledge that he openly came out right at the beginning of his presentation on that matter. Right at the end of his presentation, he did another interesting thing, which I also found remarkable, and that is he brought the opposition into the mainstream political debate and conversation and decision-making of the parliament itself, which was fascinating. So he didn't only play the oppositional game, pushing them out, or the leader game and not acknowledging them. He brought them and made them part of that conversation as well. And then the third very significant thing that he did in his presentation, which I thought was also significant, was the way in which he presented the Western Cape. So he presented the Western Cape as a diverse province at the level of religion, diverse at the level of diversity in terms of culture, and so on. He missed, I think, the opportunity to also raise the question of diversity at the level of racism and how that is impacting negatively on the development of this province. I thought that was a very obvious missing link in his description of the Western Cape itself.
Yeah, indeed. And I know that one of the issues, and it's the controversial Provincial Powers Bill, that's the one where, you know, obviously the DA are working very much so to get that one done. And I mean, crime is the one thing that they want to also tackle, but they want total power. Provincial Powers Bill is the big thing, and he did touch on that as well. And that, of course, also coming into the fact that he's saying that the Western Cape is going to be the first load-shedding free province. So there's lots of provinces, lots of promises outlined by the provinces. But I mean, in terms of that, Reverend, what are your views on what the Premier was saying?
So what the Premier did in his speech, after acknowledging all these issues that I raised now, he's divided the province into two very clear and distinct parts. One, he dealt with the issues that I call localized issues, and he dealt with them in a different way: crime, education, jobs, housing, transport, and health. And in a sense, he dealt with that and elevated the issue of inequality to a level where he located these things. That was the one thing that he did. And those were some of the key issues that he raised. On the other hand, this level of inequality is portrayed in his demonstration and explanation of the AGOA, that very important relationship between high-level relationship between America and Africa and South Africa as well. He highlighted the issue of China and their connection to that. He highlighted the issue of technology, and then he went on to to highlight a number of issues, including things like the ports, railways, security, SAPs, and around those issues, then place the debate and conversation of what he calls the power bill. He located that conversation.
Indeed.
So what he does then in this presentation, on the one hand, he highlights the localized issues, and then he highlights a number of other issues. So the one is almost a government that is in support of helping compassionate and caring welfare type state.
Yeah.
On the other hand, government that is trapped in its situation because of the national situation, which he actually did. He did a strange thing. He actually mentioned very quickly. He mentioned the question of federalism as well, which was quite scary.
Yeah.
As part of broader discussion. So,
all right.
Issues of concern, but yeah.
All right. We'll have to park that one there. But I just want to, before we wrap up, because we have got a minute to the news. Dr. McKinley, just as a closing comment, your take on the issue of the ANC's Cader deployment and the fact that the party did in fact hand over that Cader deployment record to the DA. Quite a moment yesterday.
Yes, I think it is quite significant. I mean, first of all, just the legal implications of that. But it's going to be interesting to see what is in those papers. I don't think many of us are going to be surprised. I think it's going to be an electoral tool that is going to be used by the opposition, in this case, the DA. But it does sort of surface the broader issue, which is that at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about here in the state of our country, the state of our provinces, is the professionalization of the civic service, of the public sector, of people actually doing their jobs, of having the right people in the right places. And I think that underlies a lot of the crisis, whether it's in the DA-led Western Cape or whether it's in the ANC-led provinces, is that if we can have a lot of these programs put out, a lot of these promises, a lot of numbers, but if we don't have the right people in the right places, not much of it is going to work. And I think that's where the electorate is really looking in these elections, is to see who's going to be serious about going back to the basics. And if we're going to take Premier Lesufi's claims about rebuilding and reclaiming, then that's going to be at the heart of it.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much. I know there's too much to get through. We can't even touch the tip of the surface, literally. If you want to, please go have a look back at the State of the Province addresses. But this was really just a quick look into them. Dr. Dale McKinley giving us his views, an independent political and economic analyst. And of course, Reverend Derek Marco, National Coordinator of the South Africa Democracy Election Network. Thanks again to both of them for unpacking the Gauteng and Western Cape State of the Province addresses.